the county inspector stepped into my backyard, my neighbor Calvin Reed was standing beside a half-built patio with a face that had gone completely pale. 3 days earlier, that same man had leaned over a brand new fence and told me I should be grateful he was cleaning up wasted space. The wasted space he was talking about was my land, 6 feet of it. He had moved my back fence while I was asleep, cut down the shrubs my father planted years before, dumped gravel across the soil, and brought in a contractor to build an outdoor kitchen, a stone patio, and a retaining wall on property that had never belonged to him. And when I told him the fence was wrong, he laughed. He said, "Fences move all the time." He said, "Property lines are not always where people think they are." Then he said something that told me exactly what kind of man I was dealing with. If you cared about that strip, you should have used it. He thought I would scream. He thought I would tear the fence down with my bare hands. He thought I would make one angry mistake in front of his contractor, his cameras, and the neighbors watching from their decks. I did not. I took pictures. I saved video. I pulled out my deed, my old survey, the county plat, and every permit record I could find, and less than 2 weeks later, Calvin was standing in that same backyard while a county inspector marked his project as unpermitted. A licensed surveyor confirmed the fence had been moved more than 6 feet onto my property. And my attorney asked his contractor one simple question. "Who told you this land belonged to your client?" That was when the contractor stopped looking at me and started looking at Calvin. Because the patio was not just too close to the property line, it was over the property line. The gas line had no approved permit. The retaining wall violated setback rules. And the county records showed Calvin had already been warned months earlier that he could not build where he wanted to build. So he did what arrogant people do when the rules get in their way. He moved the fence and hoped no one would check, but I checked, and by the time it was over, Calvin had to tear out the patio, pay to restore my yard, replace what he destroyed, reimburse my survey costs, and explain to half the neighborhood why his dream backyard project had become a public code enforcement case. Before I show you how one old survey turned his entire story against him, like this video, comment what you would have done if you woke up and found your fence moved overnight. And save this story. Because sometimes the most expensive mistake a neighbor can make is assuming quiet. People do not keep records. I bought that house because I wanted a quiet place to rebuild my life, not because I wanted to fight over dirt with a neighbor. It was a modest ranch-style home at the end of a curved street. The kind of place people drove past without noticing. The paint on the shutters had faded from dark green to something closer to gray. The kitchen still had old tile. The garage smelled like sawdust and gasoline, no matter how many times I cleaned it. But the backyard was different. That backyard was the reason I signed the papers. It was not huge, but it had privacy. Along the rear fence, there was a narrow strip of ground where my father helped me plant a row of shrubs the first spring after I moved in. He was already sick then, though he tried to hide it. He showed up with gloves, a shovel, and a thermos of coffee, acting like digging holes in hard clay was just another Saturday morning. We planted 9 shrubs that day. Nothing expensive, nothing rare, just hardy green shrubs that could survive heat, rain, and my lack of gardening talent. But every year they grew thicker. They softened the fence line. They gave the yard shade in the late afternoon, and after my father passed, that strip of land stopped being just part of my lot. It became the place where I could still hear his voice, so when people say it was only 6 feet, they do not understand what 6 feet can hold. 6 feet can hold years, it can hold memory, it can hold the last good day you had with someone before life changed forever. The neighborhood did have an HOA, but until Calvin's project I barely dealt with it. They cared about paint colors, mailbox posts, sheds, fences, and exterior changes. Annoying sometimes, but predictable. I had never needed them for anything serious because my property had never been under attack. For the first few years, nothing about that back fence seemed unusual. It was old, weathered, and slightly uneven, but it had been there when I bought the house. During closing, I received the usual stack of documents: deed, title policy, plat map, inspection report, and a survey showing the rear property line sitting several feet beyond the fence. right through the area where those shrubs were planted. My real estate agent even mentioned it. During the final walkthrough, she said, the fence was not exactly on the property line, which was common in older subdivisions. She told me the survey mattered more than the boards. I remembered that. I kept the folder at the time. Calvin Reed lived behind me, but I barely knew him. His yard backed up to mine at an angle, separated by that old fence and the line of shrubs. He was friendly enough in the beginning. Not warm exactly, but civil. He waved when he was mowing. He asked once if a tree branch from my side could be trimmed. I said yes, and we split the cost. Then his attitude started changing. It happened after he began talking about his backyard transformation, as he called it. He wanted a stone patio, a built-in grill, an outdoor bar, string lights, a fire pit, and a retaining wall that would make his yard look like something from a landscaping magazine. The problem was space. Calvin's backyard was shallow. His house sat closer to the rear line than mine did, and the slope behind his garage limited what he could build. At first, he joked about it. He said the developer must have cheated him out of a real yard. Then the jokes became complaints. Then the complaints became comments about the dead strip behind my fence. I knew which strip he meant. He meant the shrubs. He meant my father's shrubs, one afternoon, while I was carrying groceries from my car. Calvin stood near the fence and said that back corner looked neglected. I told him it was not neglected. It was planted that way on purpose. He shrugged and said it was a shame to waste usable land. That was the first time I felt something tighten in my chest, not because I expected him to steal it, because he said it, like he had already decided it did not matter. After that, I started noticing little things. Survey flags appeared in his yard one weekend, then disappeared. A white contractor truck stopped by twice. I heard saws one Saturday morning, then nothing for a few weeks. Calvin became unusually friendly again, asking whether I had any big travel plans, whether I worked from home, whether I had cameras in the backyard. That last question stayed with me. I did have cameras, but I did not tell him where they pointed. I just said I had enough. He laughed like it was a joke, but his eyes moved toward the roofline. A month later, a county notice appeared on his front door. I only saw it because I was walking past with my dog. It was gone by the next morning. I did not know what it was for, and I did not ask. At that point, Calvin's project was none of my business, as long as it stayed on his side of the fence. That was all I wanted. Peace, my yard, my shrubs, the quiet line between what belonged to him and what belonged to me. But people like Calvin do not always see a boundary as something to respect. Sometimes they see it as an obstacle, and if they think nobody is watching closely enough, they convince themselves they can move the obstacle and call it improvement. I did not know it yet, but while I was trying to avoid conflict, Calvin was already planning how to take the part of my yard he needed. And the morning I saw my old fence gone, the shrubs cut down, and a new fence standing 6 feet closer to my house, I realized he had not been joking about wasted space. He had been warning me. The morning I saw the new fence, I stood at my kitchen window for almost a full minute before my mind accepted what my eyes were seeing at first. I thought, something looked different because of the light. The sun had barely cleared the roofs, and the backyard had that flat, early morning color that can make familiar things look strange. But then I noticed the gap where the shrubs used to be. They were gone, all 9 of them. The old fence was gone too. In its place stood a new wooden fence, clean, straight, and freshly nailed together. But it was not where the old fence had been. It was closer, much closer. It cut across my backyard, like someone had taken a ruler to my property and erased a section of it while I slept. I walked outside. The air smelled like cut wood and torn up dirt. Along the new fence line, broken roots stuck out of the ground. A few branches from my father's shrubs had been thrown into a pile near the corner like yard waste. Behind the fence, on the land that used to sit on my side, I could hear men talking and shovels scraping against gravel. This was not a repair. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a construction project, and it was sitting on the part of my yard where my father's shrubs had been. I called out for Calvin. He appeared from behind his garage, wearing sunglasses, work gloves, and the kind of smile people wear when they have already decided they are not going to apologize. I asked him what happened to my fence, he said. He replaced an old eyesore. I asked him what happened to my shrubs. He said they were overgrown and in the way. Then I asked why his crew was working on my side of the property line. That was when his smile changed. He told me that strip had always functioned as part of his backyard, and that the old fence had been in the wrong place. He said older subdivisions were messy, and fences rarely matched the true line. Then he said the sentence that made my hands go cold. If you cared about that strip, you should have used it. I looked at the pile of branches near the corner. I thought about my father kneeling in that same dirt, pressing soil around the roots with both hands, telling me not to worry if they looked small because things needed time to grow. And Calvin was standing there, calling it wasted space. I told him he needed to stop the work immediately. He shook his head and said, the contractor was already scheduled. The materials had already been delivered, and he was not delaying a project because I suddenly had feelings about an old fence. One of the workers stopped shoveling and looked between us. Calvin noticed and raised his voice, just enough for the crew to hear. He said he had every right to improve his property. He said, I was confusing sentimental attachment with legal ownership. He said, if I wanted to challenge him, I should bring something better than memories. That was cruel, and I think he knew it. I told him I had a survey. He laughed and pointed toward the new fence. He said, the new line made more sense for both yards. More sense, as if property rights were a decorating choice. As if my land could be moved around because his patio design looked better with a few extra feet. As if the shrubs my father planted were just clutter in the way of his outdoor kitchen. I wanted to tear the fence down, but the workers had phones. Calvin had cameras on his back porch. Neighbors were already peeking through windows, and I understood exactly what would happen if I lost control. He would turn himself into the reasonable property owner, and me into the unstable neighbor destroying a fence. So I did not touch it. I pulled out my phone and started recording. I said clearly that I disputed the fence location, that I believed the new fence had been placed on my property, and that I was asking him to stop all work until the line could be verified. Calvin rolled his eyes. Then he told the crew to keep working. That moment mattered, because from that second on he could not claim he did not know there was a dispute. I took photos of everything, the new fence, the missing shrubs, the pile of branches, the gravel, the pavers, the concrete bags, the machine tracks, the string lines, and the workers standing on the other side. I photographed the old post holes still visible in the dirt, several feet behind where the new fence now stood. Then I asked the contractor for his permit information. The foreman said Calvin had handled that. I asked for the company name. He gave it to me, but he looked uncomfortable while doing it. Calvin stepped between us and said I was harassing his crew. Then he told me if I stepped onto his side again, he would call the sheriff. His side. He said it with complete confidence, while standing beside the dirt where my shrubs had just been cut down. I told him I was going inside to contact the county. He smiled again and said, good, maybe then you'll learn where your yard actually ends. That was the second time he made the mistake of sounding too confident, because confidence is powerful when it is backed by facts. But when it is backed by arrogance, it becomes evidence of intent. By noon, the gravel had been spread across most of the strip. By late afternoon, the crew had begun setting forms for the patio. I watched from my back window, taking photos every hour, feeling that sick combination of anger and helplessness that comes when someone violates your property in broad daylight and dares you to react badly. But I did not give him that. I saved the photos, I saved the video. I wrote down every time, every name, and every vehicle plate I could see. And before the end of that day, I found the first clip from my backyard camera. At 5:17 that morning, before sunrise, Calvin's contractor had walked along the old fence with a pry bar. At 5:29, the first fence panel came down. At 5:41, Calvin stepped into frame, pointed toward my side, and watched while they pulled the shrubs out by the roots. That was the moment this stopped being a neighbor argument. It became a file. And the next thing I checked made it even worse for him. Because Calvin had not just moved a fence. He had started a project the county had already questioned. I did not touch the new fence. That was the first rule I gave myself. Calvin had taken 6 feet of my yard. destroyed the shrubs my father planted, and kept his crew working after I clearly told him the line was disputed. Every instinct in me wanted to walk outside, pull out the fresh posts and throw them back over his side, but that would have made his story easier. He could have pointed to the broken fence and said I was unstable. He could have shown the police a damaged project and acted like the victim. He could have turned my anger into the only thing anyone remembered. So I stayed inside and started building the kind of file he could not talk his way around. First, I saved the backyard camera footage. I clipped the important parts and labeled each file by time. The contractor arriving before sunrise, the old fence panels coming down, Calvin stepping into frame, the shrubs being pulled out by the roots, and the crew spreading crushed stone over the disputed strip. Then I photographed the yard again, but this time I did it like evidence, not like a homeowner in shock. I took wide shots showing my patio, the new fence, and the back of Calvin's house in the same frame. I took close-ups of the old post holes, the broken roots, the discarded branches, the gravel, the pavers, the concrete bags, the orange paint, and the equipment tracks. I also photographed something Calvin probably forgot about: the old irrigation line. Years earlier, I had installed a simple drip line for the shrubs. It ran exactly along the old planting bed, and now parts of it were torn out beside the new fence. It showed that strip had not been random overgrowth. It had been maintained, it had been used, it had been part of my yard for years. Then I pulled out my closing documents. I laid the deed, the title policy, the plat map, and the old survey across my kitchen table. The survey showed exactly what I remembered. My land extended beyond the old fence, through the shrub line, and toward the area where Calvin's crew had spread gravel. That was the first confirmation. But I knew an old survey would not be enough if Calvin wanted a fight. So I searched both properties on the county website. The parcel map matched my survey. Then I searched the permit database using Calvin's address. That was when things got interesting. There was no approved permit for a patio, no permit for an outdoor kitchen, no electrical permit, no gas line permit, no retaining wall permit. But there was one old entry from several months earlier: permit application denied. I opened it. The denial note said, the proposed backyard improvement failed setback requirements and required a revised site plan showing accurate distance from the rear property line. It also said no construction could begin until approval was granted. I read that twice, then I printed it. Calvin had not just guessed wrong. He had already been told. There was a problem with where he wanted to build next. I sent Calvin one written notice by email and certified mail. I kept it short. I stated that I disputed the fence location, believed the fence and construction materials were on my property, had not authorized removal of vegetation or work on my land, and demanded that all work stop until a licensed surveyor verified the boundary. I did not call him names. I did not threaten him. I put him on notice. He replied. 20 minutes later, his message said the new fence reflected the practical use line between the properties. He claimed my old shrubs had encroached into his improvement area, and he said any delay would cost him money. Then he added that if I continued interfering, he would seek damages. That email was almost as useful as the camera footage, because now he had admitted in writing that he was not relying on a legal property line. He was relying on what he called practical use. I forwarded everything to a real estate attorney named Dana Mercer. She called me back the same afternoon and asked one question that made the whole situation feel real. Has he poured concrete yet? I looked out the window. Not yet. She told me that mattered. Gravel could be removed. Forms could be pulled, but once concrete was poured, the cleanup would become more expensive and the dispute more complicated. She told me to hire a licensed surveyor immediately and contact county code enforcement before the crew moved to the next stage, so I did both. The surveyor agreed to come the next morning. Code enforcement took my complaint and asked me to upload photos, video, the permit denial, and current worksite images. I sent everything in one organized folder. That night I barely slept, not because I was afraid Calvin would win, but because I could still see my father's shrubs lying in that pile like trash. I kept thinking about the way he said, I should have used the land if I cared about it, as if quiet ownership counted less than aggressive construction. The next morning, the surveyor arrived before Calvin's crew did. He checked the old markers, measured from the corners, compared the plat, and placed bright pink flags along the true rear boundary. I watched from my porch as the line appeared across the yard. It was worse than I thought. The new fence was not a few inches off. It was not a misunderstanding caused by an old subdivision map. It was 6 feet inside my property at one corner and almost 5 feet at the other. The gravel, the patio forms, the torn irrigation line, and the place where the shrubs had been removed were all on my side. When Calvin came outside and saw the flags, his face tightened. He told the surveyor those markers could not be right. The surveyor did not argue. He simply handed me the preliminary field notes and said the certified report would follow. That quiet confidence did more damage than shouting ever could. By noon, Dana had the photos of the flags, the camera clips, Calvin's email, and a permit denial. She sent him a preservation letter and a demand to stop all work immediately. This time, Calvin did not reply with jokes. He replied with silence, and sometimes silence tells you more than an argument ever could. Because the man who had been so confident when the fence moved suddenly had nothing to say once the real line was standing in bright pink flags across his unfinished patio. Before I explain what the certified survey uncovered next, subscribe to the channel, save this story, and check your own property records if you have ever wondered whether an old fence is really the legal boundary, because what came next proved this was not just arrogance. It was a plan. The certified survey arrived the next afternoon, and the first thing Donna told me was not to forward it to Calvin myself, she said. Let me send it, that told me. The document was worse for him than I expected. The survey did not use emotional language. It did not care about my father as shrubs, Calvin as patio design, or the argument we had beside the fence. It simply showed measurements, boundary markers, recorded plat references, and the exact position of the new fence. And the numbers were brutal. At the widest point, Calvin's fence sat 6 feet and 4 inches inside my property. At the narrowest point, it still crossed more than 5 feet over the line. The gravel base, the patio forms, the torn irrigation line, and the area where the shrubs had been removed were all inside my lot, not close to the line. Not questionable inside it. But the survey was only the beginning. Donna compared the certified boundary to the permit denial I had found the day before. Months earlier, Calvin had submitted a site plan for a patio, outdoor kitchen, and retaining wall. The county rejected it because the plan violated setback requirements and failed to show enough distance from the rear property line. In other words, Calvin had already been told that his project did not fit where he wanted to build it. Then, instead of redesigning the project, he moved the fence. That changed the whole story. This was no longer a neighbor relying on an old fence and making a careless mistake. This was a neighbor who had been warned by the county. Waited until early morning, removed the old boundary marker everyone could see, destroyed vegetation on my side, and created a new visual line that made his project appear legal from a distance. Dana called it evidence of intent. I called it arrogance with a paper trail. Then she found the detail that made the contractor nervous. The contract between Calvin and the landscaping company included a line stating that the homeowner was responsible for confirming property boundaries, permits, utility clearances, and legal access to the work area. Calvin had signed it. That meant Calvin had personally represented that the land was his and that the project could legally begin. The contractor could still have problems for starting work too quickly, but Calvin had given them the map, the access, and the confidence. And that confidence was now turning into liability. The camera footage made it worse. At 5:41 a.m., Calvin was not inside his house waiting for a crew to make an innocent mistake. He was standing in the yard, pointing toward my side of the fence, while the workers pulled my shrubs out of the ground. Then there was his email. The phrase "practical use line" became one of the most important pieces of the entire case. Donna explained that people often try to blur property disputes with casual language. They say a line was always understood, always treated that way, always used that way, but unless there is a legal doctrine that actually applies. Those phrases do not move a deeded boundary, and Calvin's own email showed he knew the difference. He did not write legal property line, he wrote practical use line. That phrase told everyone he was trying to replace the recorded boundary with convenience. Dana sent him a demand letter that afternoon. It listed the certified survey, the camera footage, the damaged shrubs, the torn irrigation line, the denied permit, the missing approvals, the contractor agreement, and his written refusal to stop after being notified of the dispute. Then it demanded immediate removal of the new fence, full restoration of the old boundary area, reimbursement for the survey, preservation of all communications, and no further work until the county completed its review. She also copied the contractor. That was the part Calvin did not expect. Less than an hour later, the contractor called Dana's office. I did not hear the call, but she summarized it afterward. The contractor suddenly wanted to know exactly where the survey flags were, whether the county had opened a code case, and whether Calvin had provided inaccurate boundary information. When Calvin said that land belonged to him, he did not realize he was not just lying to me. He was handing his contractor a liability problem with his own signature on it. By sunset, the crew had stopped working. The materials were still there. The gravel was still spread across my land. The new fence still stood in the wrong place. But the sound of shovels and machines had gone quiet. For the first time since I found the fence, Calvin was not controlling the pace anymore. The documents were. The next morning, code enforcement emailed me a case number. An inspector was scheduled to visit. Calvin must have received the same notice, because 10 minutes later he sent me a message. It was not an apology, it said. He hoped I understood that involving the county would delay repairs for both properties and create unnecessary expenses. He said, we could still resolve it neighbor to neighbor if I withdrew the complaint and allowed him to adjust the fence after his project was complete. After his project was complete. That one sentence told me he still thought he could finish first and negotiate later. I forwarded the message to Dana. She replied with one line. He just made our argument stronger, and she was right, because once the inspector arrived, Calvin would not be explaining a misunderstanding. He would be explaining why he continued pushing a project after a denied permit, a disputed boundary, a certified survey, a preservation letter, and a code enforcement complaint. That was the legal turn. Not one dramatic confession. Not one secret recording. Just a stack of documents proving the same thing from different directions. The survey showed where the land was. The permit denial showed what Calvin had already been told. The contract showed what Calvin had promised. The camera showed what Calvin had done. And his own emails showed he kept going anyway, before the county inspector ever stepped into the yard. The case had already stopped being about a fence. It was about a plan that failed because the person behind it assumed nobody would check the paperwork. And I had checked every page when the county inspector arrived. Calvin was not smiling anymore. A few days earlier, he had stood behind that new fence with his sunglasses on, acting like the extra 6 feet of my yard had always belonged to him. But now, with a county vehicle near the curb, a code enforcement officer walking toward the backyard, and my attorney Donna Mercer beside me, with a folder in her hand, Calvin stayed close to his patio forms and kept looking at the ground. The inspector's name was Aaron Fields. He was calm, direct, and completely uninterested in neighborhood drama. He did not care who had lived there longer. He did not care who thought the new fence looked better. He did not care that Calvin had already paid a contractor or that materials were sitting in the yard. He asked for documents. Dana handed him the certified survey, the county plat, the permit denial, Calvin's email about the practical use line, and the photos showing the old post holes, the torn irrigation line, and the shrubs pulled out by the roots. Then Aaron walked the yard. He followed the survey flags from one corner to the other. He compared the marked boundary to the new fence. He looked at the gravel base, the patio forms, the stacked pavers, and the utility materials beside Calvin's garage. He paused where the shrubs had been removed and looked back at the survey. Nobody said much. That silence was worse for Calvin than any argument. Finally, Aaron turned to Calvin and asked for the approved permits for the patio. Retaining wall, electrical work, and gas line. Calvin said the contractor was handling that. The contractor, who had arrived after getting a call from his foreman, immediately shook his head. He said, His company had been told the homeowner had already handled the property layout, and that permits were in progress. Aaron asked if any permit had been approved. No one answered, so Aaron answered for them. There were no approved permits. Then he pointed to the survey flags and said the work area crossed onto my property. He did not say it dramatically. He did not need to. The flags, the documents, and the unfinished patio said enough. Calvin tried to recover. He said there had been confusion about the old fence. He said the previous owner had never objected. He said everyone knew fences were not always exact. Dana handed the inspector Calvin his denied permit record. That was when the tone changed. Aaron read the denial note, then asked Calvin whether he had received notice months earlier that the proposed project failed setback requirements. Calvin said he did not remember the exact wording. Dana then handed over Calvin's email, asking me to withdraw the complaint and let him adjust the fence after the project was complete. Aaron read that too. After that, Calvin stopped talking. The inspector issued a stop work order on the spot. A bright notice was posted near the project area. The patio forms could not be poured. The retaining wall could not continue. No electrical or gas work could proceed. No materials could be moved deeper into the disputed area without authorization. Then, code enforcement opened a formal case. The contractor's face changed when Aaron explained that performing work without approved permits was one problem, but performing work across a documented property boundary was another. The contractor started separating himself from Calvin immediately. He said Calvin had provided the layout, approved the work area, and represented that the fence line was correct. Calvin turned toward him like he had been betrayed. But that is the problem with dragging other people into a bad plan. The moment the paperwork comes out, everyone starts protecting themselves. Dana asked the contractor whether his company would agree in writing not to perform any further work until the boundary dispute and permits were resolved. He said yes before Calvin could object. That answer landed hard. For the first time, Calvin was standing in the middle of his unfinished backyard project with no crew moving, no inspector agreeing with him, no contractor defending him, and no fence line left to hide behind. Then Aaron walked to the new fence. He looked at the posts, the fresh concrete at the base, and the way the panels cut across the survey flags. He told Calvin that any structure placed across the documented property boundary would need to be removed or corrected. He also said restoration of the disturbed area might be required after final review. Calvin finally looked at me. Not angry this time, nervous. That was when I realized his confidence had only existed, while he thought this was between two neighbors. The moment it became a county file, a contractor liability issue, and a legal demand, the performance fell apart. Later that afternoon, Dana sent the formal demand letter. It required Calvin to remove the fence from my property, restore the boundary area, replace the destroyed shrubs, or pay their assessed value, repair the damaged irrigation line, remove the gravel and materials from my land, reimburse the survey cost, and cover the legal fees caused by his refusal to stop after written notice. She also demanded that all communications between Calvin and the contractor be preserved. That last part made him very quiet, because now the question was not only what he had done, it was what he had told other people before they did it for him. 2 nights later, the neighborhood found out, not because I posted about it. I did not need to. The stop work notice was bright enough. And Calvin's half-built patio sat there like a monument to bad judgment. Neighbors walked by slower. People who had barely spoken to me before asked whether the fence was really 6 feet over. Someone else said Calvin had bragged for months that he had solved his backyard space problem. Solved. That word spread fast at the next HOA open meeting. Residents asked whether the association had approved Calvin's exterior change. Because I had already mentioned the HOA in my complaint, the architectural committee had to address it publicly. The committee chair admitted they had received a vague request about backyard improvements, but no one had approved work over a property line, removal of another owner's vegetation, or unpermitted construction. Calvin tried to say the HOA had never objected. The chair answered carefully. Not objecting to a vague idea was not the same as approving illegal work. That sentence hit the room like a door closing. After that, Calvin stopped attending meetings for a while. But the case did not stop. The county required a correction plan. The contractor refused to continue until permits were properly approved and the work area was legally confirmed. Dana pushed for restoration before any settlement discussion, and Calvin, who had once told me I should have used the land if I cared about it, was now being told by 3 different parties that he had no right to touch it at all, before we get to what he had to pay and how the fence finally came down. Share this story with someone who thinks an old fence is always the property line, because sometimes the fence is just wood. The truth is in the records. The fence came down on a Thursday morning. There was no apology first, no dramatic confession, no moment where Calvin walked over, looked me in the eye, and admitted he had tried to take something that was not his. Instead, a different crew showed up with a truck, a trailer, and a copy of the correction plan the county had required. Calvin stood near his back door with his arms folded, watching them remove the same fence he had acted so proud of only a few weeks earlier. This time he was not giving orders, he was listening to them. Post by post, panel by panel, the new fence came apart. The workers pulled the concrete footings out of the ground, removed the gravel that had been spread across my land, and loaded the unused pavers back onto a trailer. The patio forms disappeared before noon. The outdoor kitchen materials were stacked near Calvin-esque garage, untouched, like the remains of a dream that had gotten too big for the property it was supposed to fit on. Then came the part that mattered most to me, the restoration. The contractor had to repair the damaged irrigation line, remove the crushed stone from my side, level the torn-up soil, and install temporary erosion control until the yard could be replanted. Calvin had to pay for the certified survey, the county correction fees, my legal costs related to the demand letters, and the replacement value of the shrubs his crew had destroyed. But no amount of money could bring those exact shrubs back. Dana understood that. She had a local nursery prepare a replacement plan with mature plants as close as possible in size and type to what had been removed. They were not the same shrubs my father and I had planted, but when they went into the ground along the restored line, it felt like the yard was breathing again. Calvin avoided me the entire time. If he had to walk outside, he stayed near his patio door. If I stepped onto my porch, he went back inside. The man who once told me I should have used the land if I cared about it suddenly had no interest in discussing land at all. The county kept the case open until the correction work passed inspection. That mattered because Calvin could not simply remove the evidence, promise to behave, and start again quietly. Any revised patio plan had to be submitted with a proper site plan, correct setbacks, and proof that the work stayed on his property. The contractor also received a written warning for starting work without verified permits and boundary confirmation. After that, the neighborhood changed. Not loudly at first, but people started checking things. One neighbor ordered a survey after realizing her side fence had been installed years before anyone on her street bought their homes. Another asked the HOA for written approval records on a shed built near his property line. Someone else told me he had always assumed his fence was the boundary until he saw Calvin's stop work notice. That was the part Calvin hated most. Not the money, not the correction plan, not even the fact that his backyard project had been delayed for months. He hated that people knew. He had spent so much time acting like the smart homeowner who had found a way to solve his space problem. But once the records came out, that story changed. He was not clever, he was not practical, he was not improving unused land. He had moved a fence and hoped nobody would check. At the next HOA meeting, the architectural committee changed its review process. Any project involving fences, retaining walls, patios, or property line work would now require a recent survey before approval. They did not mention Calvin by name, but they did not have to. Everyone in the room knew why the rule changed. I never got a real apology from him. A letter from his attorney said Calvin regretted that the boundary issue had caused inconvenience. That was the word they used. Inconvenience. As if losing my shrubs, my privacy, and 6 feet of my backyard had been a scheduling problem. But by then I did not need his apology. I had the fence back where it belonged. I had the land restored, And I had proof that a quiet homeowner with records can be a lot harder to push around than an angry homeowner with nothing but words. A few weeks after the new shrubs were planted, I stood in the backyard with a cup of coffee and looked at the line where everything had happened. The soil was still darker where the ground had been disturbed. The plants were smaller than the old ones had been. The yard did not look exactly the same. Maybe it never would, but it was mine again, and that mattered. Because property lines are not just marks on paper. Sometimes they protect the place where you work, where you rest, where your family gathers, and where memories take root long before anyone else sees value in the land. So if you ever find yourself staring at a fence that suddenly seems to be in the wrong place, do not start by tearing it down. Start by taking pictures. Check your deed, find your survey, look up the permits, ask for the records, and never let someone convince you that land becomes theirs just because they were bold enough to use it first. Because sometimes the strongest boundary is not the fence standing in the yard. It is the paper proving where that fence was supposed to be. If this story made you think differently about property lines, like the video, share it with someone who owns a home, and comment whether you would have stayed calm if you woke up to find 6 feet of your yard gone overnight. I did not win because I was louder than Calvin. I won because the recorded boundary was louder than his practical use line.